Wingxing, thank you for inviting me here. And it's become a very productive workshop series over the years. What I'll be doing today is, and it sort of follows from the general, themes this morning, but also Nihal's presentation, is try to think about really in terms of how we look at forms of co-option as well as resistance, and trying to think about a kind of language of critical thinking that sort of represents contemporary forms of city politics, where the urban itself starts opening up in unconventional ways. One of the points I want to sort of emphasize is about critical thinking is looking at political practices which have a strong material aspect to it, which in the urban context sort of disrupts capital or singular forms of capital, both within and outside of its logic. So I'll give you some illustrations of that. And the second point I want to do is to really think about, and this is different from the abstract I put in, but more related to the overall title for the session, is how do we think about teaching and so the practice of teaching, critical pedagogy, and where one can start to explore incompleteness, gaps, the margin and cracks, as Nihal was talking about, not just from a marginalized perspective, but as sort of entry points to more substantive politics. So I'll be sort of ending with that. And what I'll be doing is showing you a range of both slides and text forms. So we'll kind of interspace between both. And we'll get back a little bit to this image, which is trying to capture the kind of mass housing resettlement done for groups who are considered poor. And you can, I don't have a pointer, but you can see this in terms of the two-storied housing. This is a kind of classic kind of eviction resettlement on the quote-unquote urban periphery. And but what you also find is maybe small, what look to be small, insignificant shrines, which may seem to be kind of marginal, kind of counter insurgencies, sort of counter planning. But when you think about the Supreme Court kind of passing orders, there's obviously something more going on. So my argument is that one really needs to enter the realm of land and land tenure and claims to be able to understand these politics, and far beyond the frame of the planned city or the master planned city, because I feel that itself is a disciplining frame. Now, what I'll be doing is, with the time, is having about 5 sections, and I suddenly noticed that the numbering has been disciplined by the computer program. So it's become 1, 2, 1, 1, 1. But anyway, we'll have to subvert that. So first I'll give you a very brief idea about sort of shifts in the kind of political landscape. Essentially arguing that a lot of governmental programs in terms of planning, quote-unquote welfare, various sort of interventions went through a sort of shift from the 70s, 80s, and then suddenly the urban was discovered before the global city was then discovered. And before these discoveries, you had one realm of politics, where the urban was more in a form of sort of reactive to, okay, there are these people settling out over here. But after the discovery of the urban and the discovery of the global city, there's a far more stringent disciplining and form of co-option, including, as you would see in the second part, what some of us started to call the triple D, disconnected, disciplined, depressed. And this is a kind of self-criticism of activism and activists, and and the idea is that a lot of the stuff that is coming out, which is seen to be counter-planning or is not just co-opted, but actually becomes part of the manufacturing frame of how a form of disciplining starts to happen within new forms of politics. So if that's the situation, how do you get criticality back into researching the city? In this particular context, I have found land issues to be very central. Maybe it's a kind of fetish, but anyway. But I feel that also helps in sort of teaching about criticality and getting it to where the city becomes a more experiential form of understanding power and how it gets constituted. So I'll look at the last two on that. Now, here in the transitions towards what's now become very common in terms of public-private partnerships and that range of architecture of terms and acronyms, I think the situation is different from the mid to late 80s when several of us were involved with the national campaign for housing rights, and the language we used, the visions we had. I mean, I think that those kind of grammars actually don't hold today. In fact, those same grammars are being co-opted into, including the rights-based framework, to fund, to justify some of the most harshest market-based housing settlement programs. So, if the old style 80s, which several Bhubaneswar, a colleague over several research projects and friends, and when we were all involved in this, I think the changes that started happening to 90s and 2000s don't allow the old language to work. So what exactly then are we moving towards? Now, just to give you a sense of where this was going, as Nihal was talking about upgrading and stuff like that, that was the stuff of right from the 60s to the 80s, and there were several sort of government programs which essentially allowed a lot of municipal politics, sort of good, unruly kind of messy local politics, to actually appropriate, to establish claims over land and territory in the face of a kind of master planned city, which was, despite its kind of norms, whether it's Chandigarh or Bhubaneswar or any other place, was essentially elitist, and there's been a lot written on that. But what we have is that after the arrival of the urban, especially post 1995, with and particularly USAID promoting what was called the urban reforms agenda 1, 2, and 3, you suddenly start finding a new form of architecture of developmentalism, which talks about urban governance, decentralization, entry of microcredit, making the poor investable and then the cities themselves investable through public-private partnerships, various forms of transfer development rights. So there's a grouping of instruments which come to be deployed in this process of particular forms of investments being sought. Now, it is this actually emphasis on investable which actually then closes other forms of economic and political logics, and I think that's the idea of trying to avoid being co-opted. The political underpinnings are also there as part of the sort of decentralized urban governance, which seemed very nice because it was participatory and it's supposed to get people together. But what terms people were participating on, what were the issues? I think in reflection it was interesting, the planner and us activists, we were the first to get seduced on that. But if you talk to the people who were actually lobbying with local government to get basic services and infrastructure, they were always suspicious of what was being given down to them. So in a sense, the co-option was happening not of quote-unquote the people in a very broad way, but actually the planners, architects, activists, researchers. That's where the co-option, and it's no surprise that in today's, if there's any survey being done, despite the progressive stance adopted by the researchers, when they go into a settlement, they're chased out, no photographs are allowed, sometimes they're beaten up, and there's a strong suspicion of who the researchers, who are you an informer of. And I think this sort of questioning of the stance of the researcher is central to the production of knowledge, and and I think we should come back to this. These are just acronyms which I don't want to bore you with, but these are some of the biggest now urban development program. The point I just want to make is that in the new architecture, the urban program, they've tried to discipline the way the funds can be manipulated by what they see as a local corrupt bureaucracy. The point here being that if you trace down ethnographically, and you need kind of quiet research for this, what really is manipulation of corruption of funds coming down by India's biggest program, which is otherwise meant for urban renewal, is that it gets rooted into forms of territory and territorialization which disrupts singular forms of property. So if Wing Xing, as a developer from Hong Kong, is coming into Bangalore to set up a new mall, suddenly he would find that the funds promised to him by the central government under one of these, or to make land available, gets occupied by other people who are having other mini malls selling quote-unquote counterfeit products made in China over there, which will not allow him to sell his Hong Kong-rooted big brands coming from Europe. So I'm just making this point to say that one has to problematize corruption, and it's not a surprise that some of the big anti-corruption campaigns, which are posed as social movements, apologies to managing custodians, were actually not very different from those which aim to close up that level of politics, which people had learned to appropriate quite well. Sorry. Now, I think the point is the disconnect I feel is really from a closer understanding of what is working on the ground. And my own feeling is that a lot of urban research till the mid-80s, early 90s attempted to understand, for example, like how land regularization worked, the politics of it and all. And by the 90s, all those interests went off, and people started to focus on how to make cities global, and if they're global, or they're necessarily going to become global, then how do you make them inclusive, which already assumes that you want to be global in some form and a particular type of globality. And instead, all these practices on the ground started to be located within a narrative of slums and land mafias and touts. And in a sense, economy posed as the informal sector, the city homogenized into sort of universalized timelines and spaces. Now, I think this is, once you had that, then you would always have, even if you're applying to a progressive foundation, the question will be how can your research be more policy oriented, which itself then locks you into, if not anything else, but at least an anxiety that where are you going to end up. And this itself is a disconnect because a lot of the politics in the law rejects policy making as a basic frame and instead looks at other political realms and logics. And I think I just put in the student part there because recently in my teaching I was giving students as assignments to come up with their final projects as installations. So they didn't have to do any, they could write as kind of essays, but they could also think in other forms. Anyway, I'll come back to that, but with the sort of understanding that we talk about power and the urban. But I'm just making this point that to say that in the way we think about what we teach becomes central to getting out of this sort of gridlock in a sense. Now, these are just quick illustrations of particular realms of co-option. So if you take the hawkers and vendors bills, you take researching on SEZs, special economic zones, a lot of mapping by Google, and MFIs are microfinance institutions. You talk about, there's a lot of mapping going on, ecological mapping, environmental mapping. The point is this, that these realms of research itself start to get complicated when you look closely at the kind of material that is generated from it. And this is important because on one hand, like we have Project Platinum, which is inspired by Hernando de Soto to have digital land titles. It confronts, despite concerned researchers to show these in its kind of panoptic form, the actual subversion is happening through kind of older technology or government notes which actually subvert the logics of these kind of titling projects. So in a sense, the kind of transparency that they see is not as much as to get clarity as to come out of a fear of being subverted by an opaque politics. And I think this is an important point because a lot of progressive politics is seen to be that of revealing and resolving, whereas actually this other politics is really talking about opaqueness, illegibility, not being surveyed. And I think this is an important kind of point. And and then these would be sort of spaces where the paperwork gets generated, but these would be demonized as part of the patron-client politics or the touts or the illegal land mafia. These are all terms you'll see in a lot of writing. Now, I just will run through some, I have about 10 minutes and I'm forgetting 10. Sorry, I didn't know what that means.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
So
this is a photograph of I don't know whether you can see Hyundai over there. This is a photograph of a special economic zone outside Chennai, Sriperumbudur, and which is outside the town of that place, and is seen as India's next Shenzhen. It's got Foxconn, it's got Nokia, it's got Hyundai, of course, Saint-Gobain, the big glass factory. And the point is this, that I'm just using this as an illustration, that as a special economic zone, the only imagination both of this place is that of India's potential Shenzhen if it wasn't for the slums. Okay? And this is a report from The Guardian based on a recent World Bank report which looks at land issues in India. And so you find that in a major World Bank paper. They were key in the New Economic Geography, the WDR 2008. Where they were specifically contrasted Sriperumbudur with Shenzhen, saying that once you could rein in the unplanned area of the city, the slums, then you would sort of make it the Shenzhen. Now the interesting thing is that the counter to this, written by these two scholars, and you see this reckoning, so I just picked up this as an example. The counter that the only imagination of this falls within the same logic which the World Bank report is, with the only exception is that we need to throw in some welfare for some of the workers. So essentially the point I'm making is that if you look at the counter argument, there's no other imaginary which starts to operate. And just to explain this further, at a recent meeting last week, when a group of us were looking at the special economic zones in Delhi and in Sriperumbudur, the people who were interviewing workers inside the Nokia Factory on issues of labor rights and using a classical way, the way we had done the National Campaign for Housing Rights in the 80s, suddenly found to their surprise, because we were looking at, say, the quote-unquote informality of labor and therefore the lack of unions and stability, a classic kind of framework. The workers over there started to say, well, you know, we don't want this as a permanent job because it's not very skilling. Okay, we know how to use this phone, and then after some time we can disrupt it. So one of the narratives started to happen is, how do you take it? This is a cell phone. How do you take it apart and you know, rework it? But then the other sort of complication that started to happen is that while in our case, I mean, our case, I'm putting myself as a researcher type. The boundaries of the factory are right, either these boundaries or then the special economic zone. For the people who were working there, they saw a much larger territory where they could take some of the skills and work operate in other regions, often in what is called pirated brands, which would disrupt this logic, and in settlement forms which again counter this. So I'm just sort of making a point that if one doesn't sort of adopt an understanding of how political space is constructed on the ground, which is beyond these given logics, then I think we are missing out a whole range of criticalities. And I think that's essential. Others, we get locked into a kind of data management kind of role, and either there's the other side looking at poverty rates, or the progressive type again looking at poverty rates, and we are stuck with not understanding how is, you know, poverty itself being framed. Now this also links to larger schemes of digitized land titles, and you know, there are all kind of arguments made on this. We have now the unique identification number project, is what's called the UID, which is being linked in different ways. But again, here it's very easy to adopt a framework which builds up this as a kind of phantasmagoria, you know, but rather than actual forms of disruptions. And again, Jess, here I feel that and Michel de Soto has this thing about tactics and strategies. I feel that binary also is a problem, because the issue is that the subversion is not, doesn't assume that there is a structure within which you can work tactically. It's questioning the very notions of that binary itself. And I think that's an important point. Now, I'll just sort of mention 4 or 5 areas which I've especially found interesting in terms of the teaching part. Like, what is it that, what are those categories of literature which students find, and I'm talking about MA students, they have kind of mixed masters in English, economic development and developing studies. What excites them when they go to the field and then they come back and they're looking at the literature, including the one from Hong Kong on the harbour front, development by Johanna and Wing-Shing. You know, and I found that, first of all, the moment we get into an area where they can think of land beyond the property logic, and in terms of how it gets constructed, that becomes an opening in a ground. I sort of show them stuff, and the thing is to look at this is when I say not as a kind of sort of ethnic / cultural curiosity, but rather in how history gets present in shaping today's conflict. This is the case of a sort of 8-lane expressway being built on the coastal India, in coastal Karnataka, which is touted as a high growth area, which has a special, it has a special economic zone. It's a Subaltern, which makes wind turbines. It has a power plant. But then the reworking of territory happens where the road has to be changed because it confronts forms of logic over land claims which are to do with how land is possessed by certain spirits. Okay? And now the logic of spirits shaping real estate market, is very different from, or a rationale is very different from what the planners who are hired from Bangalore or from Delhi to go and then plan out this expressway, work out the cost of return and the rate of return of this investment, because the PPP, public-private partnership, and suddenly they're finding these different logics. And it's not just the developers who are coming in from Bangalore and all, but the high-end developers who are already in that location, they also work with these other logics. Now, is a kind of temple over there, is that as irrational as the belief in the global economic market has been, logical? There's a question about that. But the point is that, and there's a real politics where forms of tenurial claims also draw on, say, a 12th century form of land tenure, which was used to counter the Portuguese and then the British, is suddenly brought in today's sort of time of political chaos at the provincial level, which allowed them to use that to claim land. So the rationalities of how politics works on the ground works in a very different way. I mean, to make this clearer, if I was part of an activist group, a group of activist lawyers, which I'm sort of have an affinity to, the one based in Bangalore, they won't have thought about this because they would say, oh, that's all religious stuff, okay? And they won't, also they would see this, that once you have got the law, then that's the end in itself. Whereas what people are doing is using the law in a much more complicated, embedded way, where a particular legislation then opens up other forms of territory, which will disrupt the kind of expressway that I showed you earlier. So if you talk about this, where property gets spirited in complex forms, beyond social movements, which is very deeply embedded, and in a quote-unquote high-growth zone of, in South India, which is rivaling that of Sri Parundu, the SEZ I showed you. Then there's a crisis for how we start to, or we need to sort of think about, what is being critical. Now, I'll just move through very fast on this to list 3-4 areas where I've found to be useful. I think one thing is really thinking about transnationality versus globalization in a sense. So this allows a kind of conceptual frame which moves beyond the local. And we're talking, Stefan was talking about, scaling up. And I think that's really important in a sense of trying to think beyond locality, where it's local culture, global politics and finance, or local culture and politics and global finance, those kind of stupid binaries. Secondly, the work on institutional and legal pluralism. And, here I feel again in terms of a kind of conceptual scale. I mean, Anya Bernstein's work is on a municipality in Taipei. Mariana Wilford is on, the government bureaucracy in Toronto itself. The point is that these are conceptual frames which open up and disaggregate the state in a useful way, because then once you de-homogenize it, then it allows for understanding realms of politics, which then people can think about ways in which those spaces either open or close particular set of interventions. I think I'll just quickly go through this. One of the things which has been central is really thinking about porosity, and also in terms of not looking at the case as a kind of illustration of a meta theory, but in terms of generating categories of analysis. Because if we take that, then one is really seeking out ways in which political spaces get opened or closed, what are the processes, and then coming back to what categories are useful or not. Versus, if you remember the Guardian report on the SEZ, where data was collected and immediately you're disciplined. Now I'll just, I think I've run out of time, so I'll just end with this. I think it's sort of, academics is very useful because if you can play with the system a bit and get, I found especially students to do field work, but not just field work as the illustration of theory that they do in the literature, but something where they can think about working with that material in an open-ended way. So one of the things we've been trying is doing installations, and what would it be to have a sort of critical installation of different kind of places. And I think that opens up forms of writing which contest sort of academic articles where the genealogy of these terms is politically disempowering. It comes from a seemingly progressive stance, but actually, and in this case, this group of young authors who wrote the book Trickster City was actually that came out of an anger against them being used by academics, as native informants to write about evictions in Delhi. So I mean, I'm talking about where there's a politics which is deeply embedded within academia itself, which recreates the power structures which we ourselves on another forum in a hypocritical way are trying to counter. So I think that's where we need to sort of move. So thank you very much.
May I invite the two presenters to come up and sit there? We're waiting for questions. And it's time for questions. Yes, please.
Hi, this is a question for Solomon. I'm Garth Myers from Trinity College, Hartford. I'm Garth Myers from Trinity College, Hartford. This is a question for Solomon. Thank you. A lot of what you were saying resonated very much with my work. I do research in Eastern and Southern Africa. And, but you left me with the case of the triple Ds. So I'm wondering, it probably is some of the things on this last slide that you didn't have a chance to talk about, or the one before it I think was there. Can you talk about some of the practices that you're hinting at that we can engage in, either through teaching and pedagogy or in activism, that are anti-DDD or somehow circumvent the conscription or co-option of us?
Should we take a daily question or should I?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Problem with the technology anyway. I guess we take a range of questions first, and then we, do the answering process. So Yes, please.
I'll just add because it's actually. Thanks to both. I thought that was really fascinating and provocative, and also really resonated with the experience in Johannesburg and Durban, where I've done most of my field work. And I think there's actually something to be said about the slide that you passed by very quickly about not theorizing in the north and then using the south as an example, but actually going deeper into that. A question for both of you. Well, one, I think, to pick up on the DDD's very similar experience in South Africa, I think also of trying to figure out what the role of academics can be and researchers that are self-stylized kind of activists sometimes and are actually end up being quite disruptive to movements that they end up documenting in sometimes overly romantic or unfair ways. And I wondered if you could speak to that experience and how much self-reflexivity has happened within the activist and activist academic research set in India. I'd be very curious about that literature and evolving understanding. And I guess actually to pick up on that, Nihal, as well, I wondered about the, almost on the same line, the micro power practices within the community that you discussed. You said, I don't want to paint too much of a romantic picture, but yet I wondered, what are the disruptions within the community itself, or is that something that's kind of papered over, or are there kind of power politics within the community that you discussed that also add another layer to the way that space is then described and used?
We can take one more question before we pass the mic to presenters. Is there anyone?
Yeah. My question is directed to Professor Nihal PERERA. I've been reading some literature about subaltern, but I'm still having difficulties to grasp the exact idea about subaltern. So, if you please could you elaborate a little bit more about the subaltern? So, what exactly the idea is about subaltern? Thank you.
Thank you. And who would like to answer first?
Well, yeah, thank you all for these useful questions. I mean, these are sort of difficult ones because they're sort of in practice in a sense. But I think very briefly, I think a couple of points. I think one is that just as almost in a metaphysical way, I was making an argument that one should look, if you're looking at quote-unquote third world urbanism, then one should look beyond the frame of the planned city as a logic which is then reflective in terms of what is unplanned. So if you take even the work on Brasilia, J.B. Holston's The Modernist City versus David Epstein's much earlier work, again on Brasilia, written from a worker's perspective, you see that frame, and including my own sort of book on East Delhi in 1991, and Ravi Sundaram's one on pirate modernity, again on Delhi. In all of these works, and then including to an extent Matthew Hull's work on Islamabad, the moment you look beyond, if you look at the logic of argument there, is that first the history of the city is planned, is laid out as a master plan intervention, and then you get all the stuff which is non-conforming, and then you seek out the politics. What has happened in this case is that there's a kind of assumption of a certain structure which then shapes the counter politics, rather than looking for the counter politics on its own terms. So I feel that one of the values of, I don't know, I'm just putting it this way, sort of quiet ethnographic work without the activist's anxiety to resolve and to close every gap, or to even identify every gap. Once you're beyond that,
then I think you start to get a sense of political spaces where the person whom, say a group of people, either you're going with a group of students or you're going yourself, and you're interviewing in a highly politicized way. For example, suppose there's been evictions or there's a new hawking zone being planned and people have been moved out. If once you have that, then you suddenly realize that people are seeing you as much as with suspicion, and therefore would not like to talk too much about political spaces which they might be mobilizing. I think this recognition of multiple variegated political spaces, some of which might be public, some of them are not public, that itself is extremely important. Now, while that's a kind of a very broad, maybe even vague kind of a thing, one thing that I've personally found, and that's why I put it over there, the sort of spatializing legal and institutional pluralism, the literature that is coming out of that, overlaying that on space, I have found to be extremely productive. Now, maybe that's coming out because I've got a sort of interest in land and land tenure. But if I take that approach, then this north-south divide is also not very useful. So when I spent some time in Toronto, towards my end of the stay, especially staying near Chinatown, what was really interesting is the way the local associations along Spadina, one of the three, I think, Chinatown, were mobilizing the municipal council to create spaces for whatever, trading, trans-global trading, etc. Which had a more complicated history in terms of how particular tenure forms which are not resolved there, particularly some clauses, which on the web, by the way, the lawyers discussed, the grandfathering clause. If your property has not been remodeled, then you have certain claims to redo things with that property. Now, I'm just mentioning, if you look at that, that doesn't fit into the narrative of gentrification. Because in gentrification, you have the wave of capital filling the lowest point, irrespective of what tenures they are over there. So if you shift, and this, so this framework is a kind of beyond this north-south divide, because in a sense, land is claimed in multiple ways. And in, as Jeremy Weber, who's done some really, and other people at Victoria University and McGill, who have looked at quote-unquote customary claims by the First Nations, that's not very different in a conceptual way than what I was showing. Or so I think that one needs to, I find it, I personally find, I'm not saying, but one needs to sort of go back to towards a kind of a research agenda with acceptance of a kind of a openness in it, with the understanding that there's never going to be a full closure. And that is a political state, because if there was a full closure, then if I'm being hired by Nihal to come in with a big development project, I would use that. Maybe, I would be hiring myself, but who knows, So I think that's why, and I think linked to that is to be suspicious of the easy narratives. Where Delhi is Commonwealth Games, and Bangalore is the IT, Bombay is Shanghai. These are all easy narratives built out of a set of political closures, and I think there's a kind of challenge there of how to go beyond that.
Okay, so just going to make 3 points based on the questions that you asked. I'll begin with the micropower practices. This is a big question that I'm kind of like asking. I mean, even to ask whether this is called micropower practices. Because, say, for example, I'm sitting here, if somebody very close to me is in hospital right now, that would be a far more important question for me than who is ruling Hong Kong. So I don't know how to hierarchize these things, I mean, where to begin. nevertheless, like if I understand what you're talking about, thanks for the question, because I'm struggling with this also. I'm writing a book on people spaces. Written a piece, published a piece in 2009, and that's what I based this on. Whenever I talk about this, most people try to understand the world in dualistic terms, right? So people means, if I'm putting people as opposed to government or capital or something, people must be really great, and so on. No, they have their own conflicts, they have caste conflicts, they have, I'm trying to figure out, am I really talking about my own colleagues? Am I really, if I'm fighting for the people, should I be fighting for these guys? I don't even go to faculty meetings sometimes, right? So to kind of like to figure out, on the ground, what does it really mean? So it's a good question. They do have, I work with post-tsunami, kind of like settlements and so on, and you go and you work and you work with them, and you see, one family doesn't talk with the other family, and so on. And then I'm not sure. As Solomon said, should I map it? Should I ever come to a closure? Probably not. But I think we have to work with this. So that's very important. There is power politics inside, micropower or backstage politics or whatever, however you call it. If I may touch on the question that you asked, in regard to self-reflexivity. I do a field study in South Asia. I bring students from the United States every other year. I've done this since 1999. It's called CAP Asia, College of Architecture and Planning in Asia. The biggest thing I ask the students is kind of like, we work with communities. One of the first things that we cannot do with the people is when we go there with a bunch of white kids. First of all, if we are the government, their responses will be different than if we are an NGO, which is quite possible with some white kids, right? Especially going after tsunami, and so on and so on. So it takes a while to kind of like, to make the us and them divide dissolve a little bit. To tell them we are not the state, we are not the NGOs. We are here to study as well as to participate in your own processes. Doing, I can't remember what ethnographic work that Solly mentioned. But the biggest thing I ask is, in the School of Architecture and Planning, right, which is more practical side of, practical side of geography, they are being trained that we need to tell people and people should do things. And I'm just asking, can you change a place without changing yourself? And so, how dare you say that I'm going to change this place, but I'm not going to change. So I think the biggest thing that I try to teach them is kind of like, just monitor how you change in this process. As you begin to kind of like get to know people, as you begin to overcome that the divide, between us and them, as you try to overcome their stereotypes of you, and then the students start saying, like, my stereotypes were this, and so on and so on, so to chart the path. And then again, never comes to a closure, and I don't think anything comes to a closure. The most difficult question is subaltern, okay? So that is why I kept it to the last, so if you have to go for lunch, you can do that. It's a very hard thing, like for people like Ranajit Guha, who wrote about the subaltern. It's about people without history in a certain sense, because Ranajit Guha is a historian, and what he and of course Gramsci coined this term in a larger sense. I think in a broader sense, it's used as people without a voice. People who use this term subaltern does not actually take the proletariat as a subaltern, right? There's a big debate. Is the working class subaltern or not? Because in a different sense, the working class has a voice. Marx has been the kind of like the biggest representative. There's political economists. There's a lot of people. There are a lot of people in the world without a voice. We don't even get to hear them because they don't fit into our schemes. And Ranajit Guha's point was, there were a lot of peasants were the ones who fought most hard against the colonial regime. But the Cambridge history, nor the Indian historians, picked up on that. But for the Cambridge historians, it was more like a colonial history. For the Indian historians, they were talking about the nationalist movement and so on. And of course, the Marxists talk about the proletariat movement and so on. But the peasants, fell by the side. Why? Because many a times, as I tried to mention, many a times we see things as data, and if we take them, if they fit into our scheme of things. The Gandhi and that movement fits into the anti-colonial movement, right? And any strike in some place might fit into the larger scheme of like coming to a developing revolution. That's why I also asked about these jumping scales. Is it really jumping scales, or do we want to kind of like incorporate some things that are happening within those scales, right? So if we don't see any significance of me having this, having this coffee here, it will not be a part of history. But if this might lead to a proletarian revolution or a nationalist revolution, this is a very important historic fact, right? So, so I think having said all these things, I think in a larger sense, if I may refer to the Indian peasants who never made it to history, who fell by the side of history, I think the point is there are a lot of people without voices. How can we represent? And Gayatri Spivak, who takes this much further, says we cannot represent them. And I think, because the thing is, they need to represent themselves. And as Western academics, what we can do is actually to talk about them in a Western setting. Because she writes about stories about the so-called tribals in Bengal and so on. But I don't think many people understand them anyway, and we complain that we cannot understand. I've tried very hard to understand. I can't understand. I grew up in Sri Lanka, but yet at the same time, she talks about this whole idea of informant, in a larger scheme of things, like Solly could be an informant from India. Can he ever be an informant? He cannot be for those people who are out there. So it's a very nebulous category, if you will, like so on. So these are people who fell by the side of history, basically, who don't have a voice. And I'm also kind of like highlighting this in regard to Satyakali and those people whom we call they live in slums. When we say they live in slums, they belong to our category, slums. But what if they are not living in slums? What if they live in some other place? They do have their own scheme of things, right? Can we even begin to see that, or should we open up space for them to speak? So can the subaltern speak?
Now I was wondering why you would choose to, or would you put subaltern in quotes or something?
Then you took 5 I guess Wing Sing, has lost his patience because I promised to end this section, by 1:45. Unluckily, we have difficult questions, at the very last part of the questioning time. So I pass the mic back to you.
Simply because the dim sum is waiting for us. If we will go there too late, all the dim sum will be spoiled, and then